So hi, welcome. Today is, do you know this? Today is the last day of winter, right? Something like that. So we made it, knock wood. So welcome. So tonight is the first of two events that are honoring the First Amendment. And so I just want to tell you about the next one. On May 7th, we're going to be showing a film, a documentary called Barney's Wall, about Barney Rossett, who was the publisher of Grove Press, whose struggles against censorship took him to court over Lady Chatterley's Lover, and also to the Supreme Court over Arthur Miller's Tropic of Cancer. So come and join us. I think it's going to be an interesting film, and we will have a discussion, and go on our website, you can find out about it. So let me turn to tonight's event. This is a really nice event for the center. Both David and Jameel have been friends, associates, helps, guides for a long time. So I may be looking forward to this discussion as much as anybody. David's Truth in Our Times came out, I think, last week. It's a memoir of our era as seen from the eyes of the Deputy General Counsel at the New York Times, writing in the New York Times Book Review about the book. Preet Bharara called the book a love letter to the First Amendment. David describes it as a time that he lived through that was a hell of a time to be a lawyer for the New York Times. I'm not sure when it isn't a hell of a time to, but anyway, it's a really good line. And moderating tonight is Jameel, Jaffer, who's been here countless times, I'm grateful to say. He's the executive director of the Knight First Amendment Institute at Columbia University. Jameel has been at the forefront of the issues that have concerned the center since the beginning, where national security and constitutional principles clash. So whether it's torture, drones, or any of the many other issues that have consumed our time since the beginning of the War on Terror, Jameel has been there and has guided us through. Now he's at the Knight Institute. He and his team are making waves with First Amendment challenges to Donald Trump and his attempts to block access to Twitter, to warrantless searches at the border. They have several FOIA petitions, such as recently attempting to attain government documents that can talk about what the government knew before the death of, before the murder of Khashoggi, and maybe what the government should have done to warn him. So he's right in the crosshairs of so much that is going on. So it is my pleasure to welcome both of them, and we will have about 40 minutes of, or 45 minutes of their talking to each other, and then we will open it up to you. So enjoy.
All right. Thank you, Karen, and thanks, David, for agreeing to participate in this conversation. So, first, I think the book is excellent in every way. I loved reading it. It is, thoughtful in all the ways that I expected it to be, but it is also very entertaining. And
I thought a different butt was coming there, so okay.
It's definitely more entertaining than your legal briefs, which I have had, but just as persuasive. So I want to ask you. So one of the great stories in the book is there are many stories like this, but one of the really great stories in the book is about this guy, Alexis Mardis, who is former TV repairman and friend of John Lennon, who sued the Times after the Times printed a story that called him a charlatan, and some other things as well, right?
Yeah.
But one thing I learned from the book is that Mardis is best known for this concept, the Mardis Gap, which is the gap between the idea of something and the implementation of it. I think it's a very useful phrase, the Mardis Gap.
You need that. You really need that.
Yeah, and so I thought, well, why don't I ask you a question about the Mardis Gap for press freedom? Because your book is in part about the robustness of American protections for press freedom and for free speech more generally. And you celebrate, I think rightly, the big landmark First Amendment decisions like Pentagon Papers and New York Times versus Sullivan and Bartnicki. And you say, again, I think appropriately, that American media organizations enjoy this very broad protection that doesn't exist in most other places in the world. Maybe it doesn't exist anywhere else in the world. But at the same time, and you talk about this in your book too, many of the threats that confront us now seem a little bit mismatched with those protections, right? So if you think about the surveillance powers that give the government the opportunity to identify leakers very quickly, or viral disinformation campaigns, or the fact that we have a president who gives aid and comfort to the enemies of press freedom all over the world. These are not things that the First Amendment seems particularly well suited to address. So I guess that's my first question to you. Do you think that there is that kind of, I'm not sure Mardis Gap is the right phrase for this, but this kind of disconnect between the protections that we have and celebrate and the protections that we need most right now?
Yeah, let me unpack that a little bit, which is that in the book, I talk about how I think that the law is strong and it's not going to change. And I wrote the book because I felt that you and I and a lot of people talk about the First Amendment in a very productive way for each other and for lawyers and for academics, but that I wanted to write a book for the public about how it looks at ground level. So it's really a book that Karen described as a memoir. That means I don't have footnotes. And it really is about an 18-month period from roughly October 2016 to the middle of last year. And I try to address through things that happened at the time, through narrative, how those expose either the gaps that Jameel is talking about in the law or the strength of the law. And so there's that question of, is the law going to change? And there's this question of, well, does it matter? Because there's so much pressure on that rests outside of law, the kind of things you're talking about. Now, one of the interesting things happened is just before my book came out, Clarence Thomas, of course, said that Tynes versus Sullivan should be reconsidered. And so someone very helpfully wrote and said, I'm sure your publishers had already thought of this, but you should market it off Clarence Thomas's opinion. And I always like Clarence Thomas helping me because it doesn't happen all that often. So, and so I said, well, that would be fine, but I would have to give away a magic marker with every edition of the book to cross out the line where I say the law is not going to change. Okay. Despite Clarence Thomas, I still think the law is okay. The glass is one ninth full. I'm not going to worry about it until it's about 3/9 full. But you're right. A big part of the book is about what I think is the real threat, which are those kind of things that exist outside of press law. That's both, and I don't use this term any place in the book. You can do the word search normative, but they are normative, okay? That just, what are how should press conferences be handled? How should the president behave towards the press? And I think the attack on basic norms is really the great threat. In addition, the kind of things you're talking about in terms of surveillance, the terrible state of the law concerning protection of sources continues to be a problem. But much of the book focuses on how deadly the fake news mantra is to undermining the press in America and around the world now.
And do you think, I think I already know the answer to this question, but do you think that public distrust in the media is a significant threat in itself, or are you worried about increasing public distrust in the media or decreasing public trust in the media because of the possibility that it'll give ammunition to people like Clarence Thomas who want to change the law?
Yeah, I think both of those things. If there was a poll last year in which 26% of the people said that the president should have the power to close down news organizations that misbehave. And the numbers get higher when it's Republicans. It's into the 40s when it's Republicans only. That, to me, really suggests that we have done a really bad job of explaining how the First Amendment works and why it's important and how it fits in. The president's stain on American society, enemy of the people, fake news, plays right into that. It fuels that. And the concern is, as I say in the book, that a disbelieved press isn't all that different from a shackled press, because the only power the press has is its ability to motivate public opinion, to bring change, and to monitor government, and to demand different things, hold governments accountable. And in a shackled press society, nobody believes the press because it's controlled by the government. This is what the undermining, what fake news does to undermine here is it's essentially saying, don't believe those guys, believe me. And the evil genius of the fake news mantra, of that label, is that it sounds like the pursuit of truth when it's just the opposite. It is an invitation not to think, it's an invitation to label and dismiss. And I don't really get that from my conservative friends and colleagues, as I've said in other venues. You know, I grew up in a very small town in Illinois. My parents were both veterans. My mother and my father both were World War II veterans. And when you're growing up in Illinois in the 1960s and 1970s, the thing you learn is the governor goes to jail. Otto Kerner went to jail. Dan Walker went to jail. Stam Santon, in fairness, he got off. He was indicted but got off. Then when the Secretary of State died in 1970, Paul Powell, his office was filled with shoeboxes full of money. If you were growing up as a kid in Illinois, you learned that you don't trust the government. And that used to be the hallmark of the conservative charter, and somehow we've lost it.
Is there, what can we do about that?
I wish you hadn't asked that next question. You know, that is a really hard thing, because in the end, I'm blaming everybody out there rather than the New York Times, which helps me keep my job, but probably doesn't make them all that happy. I do really believe that we need a public that's more engaged, and it starts with education. It starts with asking hard questions about the media as well as government. Those kind of things have to happen at an early age. I received one of those emails from somebody who heard me on the radio, and my first instinct, of course, when someone emails me who's heard me on the radio is nut job. Okay, now if any of you wrote to me, I really have loved your email, but you know, you wonder about who would do that. And so anyway, but it turned out it was like this really thoughtful, really thing. It says, why haven't you written a young adult book? Okay, I barely was able to write this one. I'm not yet ready to go into YA, but she said, and I think she's right about this, you have to start this process much earlier. I spoke at a college one night, and a student stood up and said, "What are we going to do about Breitbart News?" And I said, "Read it," and because I really believe in that. Let's find out what they're saying if you disagree with it. I spoke at a college media event the other day, and one of the advisors stood up and said, "You know, I don't really like anonymous sources. I'm a big believer in journalism, but how do you know it's not the janitor?" It was never the janitor. I'm here to tell you it has never been the janitor, okay? Never, okay? Now, should we be as transparent as possible about sources? We really should. Can we be transparent every time? No, but it is not the janitor. People are not asking the janitor. They probably could at the White House and get some good stuff. But anyway, that's a whole other matter. So I think it's education. I think that it requires journalists to continue doing what they're doing. I think that in the polarized environment that we're in, that it's really important to hold on to the legacy of American journalism over the last 80 years of a honest broker talking in fairness, not aligning with one side or the other. That's hard in today's world, but I think that is a model that will win public support. I think the platforms have to do more to take on fake news and help people understand what's fake and what's real. So there's no one easy solution, but...
You're too modest to say people should read my book. I actually do think that...
I like that idea.
You know, books like yours, one of the values, one of the ways in which they contribute here is by making it clear to people how organizations like the New York Times actually operate. And there's a lot of detail in the book about how you make decisions about what to publish and what not to publish, how you check facts, why you check the facts. And I think that's, getting that information to a broad audience is, I'm sure, a challenge, although you seem to be selling a lot of books. But I think if more people understood the decision-making process, that would be a step in the right direction.
Yeah, somebody from the Washington Post, which is another newspaper I hear, said that he said, that one of the things that's really good about the book was it was such a window onto reporting and how reporting is done and how hard people work. And so part of that is seeing that. The other part is, as I talk about in the book, is that I just think that fundamentally there's a very poor understanding at times about how the First Amendment works. Sue Craig is here, who plays a key role in the opening parts of the book, where she and her colleagues do this incredible story about Donald Trump's taxes based on pages from state returns that arrive anonymously in Sue's mailbox. And the day after we published that story, Sue's on the phone to me because the Washington Post has written a story that says we risk legal trouble. And it was clear that we have done a very bad job of conveying not only that we have the right to publish information in that circumstance, but that we should, and it's a good thing that we do.
So you talk a little bit in the book about how long it took you, and you characterize this as too long, how long it took you to recognize the threats that, or the threat that the current administration poses to press freedom, and you said a couple points to the rule of law. Why did it take you so long? You described near the beginning of the book a panel that you and I were both on, in which neither of us recognized the threat that the administration posed. But why did it take you so long to come to that recognition? And were there specific incidents that brought you there, or was it more of just an aggregation of things over time?
Yeah, there is a story there. The book is really a testament to misplaced optimism, right? Over and over again, I believe things are going to be all right. They're not all right, okay? I'm here to tell you they're not all right. And one of the things I did at the very end of writing the book was go back and write the introduction to say, they're not all right, so nobody would miss that. But if you go back, we can roll back that clock to it's like October, November, right, of 16. You and I are on this panel with Amy Davidson of The New Yorker and Jack Goldsmith from Harvard. And Amy's the only one who thinks Trump's going to win, and we treat her like, she's delusional. Well, were we wrong? And but Jack keeps making this point, which I actually find kind of persuasive, which, he was in the Bush administration. It's hard to change things. There are institutions in Washington that just don't move. There's the civil service employees, there the deeply embedded institutions and agencies and so forth. And I really thought that would be the story that was going to be told, and that after the campaign was over, that we would go back to something that would look a little bit like the Nixon era, where there would be a lot of tension between the president and the press, but that the institution of the press conference, the institution of the way the press covers the White House would stand up. And as we go forward, it was really those events around Inauguration Day, starting with the size of the crowd, where there was the picture of the crowd. I could see that, and this guy, Sean Spicer, looking like his head was about to implode, saying that crowd is bigger than your eyes tell you. And the next day, Trump goes to the CIA, and it's almost this demand for fealty from them. And I realized this is sort of a full-on push. Then when you get to calling the press the enemy of the people, that is just chilling. It was really chilling. I mean, calling any Americans the enemy of the people would be chilling. But as I point out in the book, and most of us thankfully don't remember this, he puts the tweet up and he takes it down for 13 minutes because he's refining it. Making it more chilling. He didn't have all the right people in there that he wanted to include.
It's the same phrase that the Saudi regime uses to characterize Jamal Khashoggi, right? So,
exactly
yes,
right.
Very chilling.
Right, and that to me is one of the incredible things is how it has spread across the world, right? You've seen it over and over again, and we're under criminal investigation in Egypt for fake news or fake news-related charges, as it were. Our reporters are banned from going into Pakistan from outside. China has blocked our website. And it used to be the State Department that would stand up and say, this is unacceptable, that we're here. I mean, they would stand up for us specifically, but they would also see part of their role as spreading the gospel of freedom. During the Bush administration, the State Department sent me out to speak in Central Europe and Eastern Europe and in the Middle East to talk about free expression and why it was important. They thought that was part of the gospel of freedom that should be spread. And now I fear that the worst governments think, if I want to curry favor with Washington, I should take on the press just the way the president does.
So a lot of the book is about access cases, and many of those cases are FOIA cases for national security information, right? And I think you've litigated more FOIA cases than any other media lawyer.
You got to put a lot of qualifiers
right?
on that,
Okay.
but yeah.
You litigate a lot of FOIA cases.
That's it.
And part of me wants to congratulate you, and part of me thinks you're crazy. I've litigated some of these cases, and in my experience, FOIA cases are very time-consuming. They rarely succeed. When they do succeed, they succeed only in very narrow ways, and long after you wanted the information, you get some small piece of the information. So why do you file these cases? Especially, the Times is obviously a news organization. You can get information in so many other ways. Charlie Savage can just call up these agencies and ask for the information, or call up his sources and ask for the information. What is the upside in litigating these kinds of cases?
Okay, and just to make sure people understand, there is a chapter on Harvey Weinstein. It's not all about access, okay? And it's a good chapter, and there's a chapter about my letter to Trump and other things. But yeah, we do talk about access. It's a lot about leaks and about national security as well. But it's a really good question why we keep pushing, and it wasn't always like that. That we kind of came to it slowly, but we file a lot of lawsuits in part because it's the only tool we have. That you're right, that the good reporters have sources, and good reporters are going to get things in other ways. But I think of the FOIA litigation as complementing that. When I first got into it, when I first started doing it, now going back 17 years or so, I really tried to be strategic to say, look, here's a case where we could set the law so it's a little better, or here's a case where these documents will be important because it's a database that's going to continually be important. And after a while, that strategic approach gave way to much more, let's keep litigating, just because we've been told no and it's wrong, it's legally wrong. What I'm really trying to do, though, in very simple terms, is we're going to be putting in a lot of FOIA requests. Our newsroom's big. It's going to be putting in a lot of FOIA requests. And I want the government to understand that we will sue, that we're not, if they say no, we're not just going to hang our head and walk away, and that's going to be the end of it. I also think it just helps create a culture of access, which we need more of. But the law is horribly broken, and the courts have been an incredible disappointment in this. A couple of years after FOIA was put into law, passed in 1966, Ralph Nader did this piece called the Freedom from Information Act, and he talks about how badly the act is working. And a sub-theme in there is that these bureaucrats aren't going to get away with this. The courts are going to come rescue all of us. And in fact, the courts have sided over and over again with the bureaucrats.
Do you find that sometimes having the document makes a significant difference to your ability to get the public's attention or convey the importance of a particular piece of information? I'm thinking in particular of, I remember when, I think it was Charlie Savage who reported on the contents of the drone memo, one of the drone memos, and then a year later, 6 months later, you got the memo itself. And there's another round of stories about the document itself.
Yeah.
Is that a common, is that another reason why you might?
It certainly helps to take it out of source says. Goes back to where we came in about the janitor. It helps to take it out of the source says box and put it in, okay, now you can see it in black and white. But there's also, I put national security in a separate box because FOIA is very difficult. We've had actually in the less sexy cases that did involve national security, we've done really well in some cases, so that David Barstow won the Pulitzer Prize for his coverage of how the Bush administration sold the war in Iraq and the war in Afghanistan to the public, using these retired generals who would appear on TV and look impartial, but were actually part of the military contracting apparatus, and were going to the Pentagon and essentially getting talking points. And we sued over that, and Judge Sullivan in the Southern District decided that we were right, and essentially ordered the government to start giving us the documents forthwith, a term I didn't really know what it meant, but it meant 48 hours, which was a pretty good deal.
So let me stay on national security a little bit longer. So there is reportedly sealed indictment of WikiLeaks in Virginia, right, in a federal court in Virginia. And we don't know on what theory the government intends to prosecute WikiLeaks, but I'm wondering, how threatened should the New York Times, other media organizations feel by that sealed indictment?
I always start all my comments about WikiLeaks by saying, are we talking about 2010? Okay, the first set of WikiLeaks documents that the Times was involved with involved Afghanistan, Iraq, and State Department cables. That was in 2010 and spilled over a little bit into 11. And if that's the focus of it, I think that's a serious challenge to all of us who are on the press side, because I have yet to see anybody who's sort of suggested how you can treat WikiLeaks as not being a publisher and not have make bad law for the Times. As you know, the first edition of the first version of the Espionage Act was passed in 1917. 102 years later, there's never been any indictment of a reporter or publisher. It's been used to go after government contractors and government employees, and whatever we think about those prosecutions, and we have problems with that as well, but at least it's not been used on the press. WikiLeaks would cross over into territory we haven't been in before, where it appears that what appears to be informing the public, which is the essence of journalism, becomes a indictable offense under the Espionage Act. That would be a very bad development. I draw the line on whatever happened in 2016. I do not know enough of the facts, what the interaction between Julian and the Russians, Julian and the hackers, and Julian and the Trump campaign. I just don't know. And I could see someone constructing an argument that some of those activities took it outside of what I would think of as journalism and put it in a different box. Still worried about the extension of the Espionage Act, but it's a different case in 2010.
What if the theory were that WikiLeaks isn't a journalistic organization in the way that here I want to read just a passage from your book, because I found this. This is a passage about 2010.
Okay.
And you are David's explaining here why he felt comfortable with the Times' decision to publish some of the State Department cables. So you say, we had been selective in what we chose to use. We had gone only with those documents that shed light on U.S. policy and the conduct of U.S. military operations and diplomacy. We had redacted names of average citizen Afghans who might be targeted by the Taliban. We'd given the government a chance to comment in advance. We had made sure that the secret documents were kept securely in our possession. So, in those senses, the Times acted responsibly. And let's say the government's theory was WikiLeaks isn't an organization like that. WikiLeaks didn't act responsibly in at least some of those senses. It didn't exercise the same kind of judgment that the Times did in deciding what to publish and what not to publish. People can debate whether that's factually true or not, but let's assume it's true, and it's the government's theory. Do you think that there is a way of drawing a line, a legal line between WikiLeaks then and the Times?
I have a hard time seeing it, in part because I think this idea of saying who's a journalist and who's not a journalist is a slightly wrong question. I think you have to look at journalistic acts. Is this an act of informing the public? And because it can't be that if you have a political opinion that disqualifies you for protection under the law. We have a political opinion every day, over and over again, in a lot of different ways. And when I look at it, the kind of things that we did, which we felt comfortable doing, and which end up being a flashpoint, really ending our relationship with Julian Assange, more on that in a second, I don't think that's really for law. Right? I don't think law's role is to make that ethical decision. I think law's role in this particular area is to decide what you can publish, what information you can publish, and what you can't. We felt that as our obligation to our readers and to our own compass as far as morality was to do these kind of things. And Julian becomes very incensed with this, where we won't link to his website because there wasn't redaction. What's interesting is what happens, and again, some of these details have been lost to time, but so the first set of papers are released, and they are all about Afghanistan. We publish a tiny number of all the documents, and Julian has a much larger set that goes out on the internet. He's immediately, he and WikiLeaks, immediately criticized by the human rights groups because he has endangered average Afghans who show up in these documents having helped the United States and its allies. And so the next time, in the next tranche with Iraq, they use mechanical redaction and essentially take out every name. And one of the first calls I get is from a lawyer who represents a group of historians in the Boston area, asking asking for the names, because they can't really, that doesn't help, right? They want to find out which general did this and what politician did that, and so that doesn't work either. It's not an easy business, but there was an attempt on his part, on WikiLeaks' part, to try to cleave to some of the norms we had. Ultimately, they all get released, and they're all out there in some way or another. But it worries me to see the focus on that particular publication round, because it was, in fact, in my mind, it meets the criteria for what should be protected, providing of information to the public in the public interest. Now, as I say in the book, Pentagon Papers had happened. There have been national security, there have been classified secrets published day after day, week after week, month after month in the New York Times. But this somehow seemed different just because the sheer size of it. And it didn't have any of those hallmarks, if you want to think of the Pentagon Papers as sort of the classic example of someone inside government or associated with government who makes a decision about the public needs to know this. It didn't have that aspect. And I thought, wow, this may be the one where there's going to be a test case, that this is the one where they may decide to draw the line, because you have both a profligate release of information and offshore sites that don't cleave to the normal rules of American journalism. Is this the one where they're going to draw the line? Now, we've now had Snowden, and it seems like the line is not being drawn.
Right, but now you distinguished 2016, right?
Yeah.
And you could imagine somebody making the argument that, well, 2016, this is where we need to draw the line, because again, I know that there's a dispute about these facts, but let's assume these facts are true, that the information at issue was hacked by individuals associated with a foreign government, with Russia, right? And the information that was ultimately published was solicited in a way that it wasn't just dropped in their laps. WikiLeaks was somehow involved in.
Yes.
And again, I don't know if those facts are true, but let's assume that they're true. Would those distinctions make you more comfortable?
if you show that someone is actually an agent of a government, and this hasn't been proven, and I think I have reasons to doubt that's the case, you're talking about something that's very different than someone exercising First Amendment rights. At some point, if you're a state actor, then that is sort of the classic case of a law that's going to not be subject to a First Amendment analysis. And that distinction is important to me in part because I was surprised, speaking of state actors, I was surprised to find myself being covered on RT a few months ago, Russian television, which is not really the coverage I want. And especially because it said that I supported Julian Assange in the Democratic hacking case, which made me curious as to how they came to that. Then I found out that Julian's lawyers had actually quoted me at length in their brief. There's a civil case brought by the people associated who were hacked on the Democratic hacking, and they've sued WikiLeaks and Russia and Trump and everybody else. And there I am, sort of prominently played out as an authority on this. Now, this concerns me because that's really not a very good way to win a lawsuit when you have to cite me. Okay, speaking at a conference like this, that's not really considered persuasive by judges. But it also concerned me because it was completely contrary to what I'd said. I'd started as I did today by saying I'm talking about 2010, and they dropped that. And to their credit, Assange's lawyers have now corrected that with the court.
So there's a larger discussion in your book about the relationship between reporters and their sources, yeah. And a lot of this, at least in the national security context, involves this balance that was struck by the Supreme Court in the Pentagon Papers case, which has effectively meant that leakers can be prosecuted, but the media organizations that publish the leaks can't be, right? And the result is that leakers go to prison and journalists collect Pulitzer Prizes, right? And
ouch.
Well, so my question is, like, what do the reporters owe to, what do media organizations owe to the sources? And maybe you can talk a little bit about General Cartwright and the letter that you wrote in that case.
Yeah, so in discussing this whole area of leaks, and Jameel has really put his finger on it, what do journalists and reporters and publishers and broadcasters owe to those people who have risked their career and their liberty to leak information to us? And we confronted this in a case involving General Cartwright, who was one of the top generals at the end of his career with the Obama administration. He ultimately is prosecuted and pleads guilty to lying to the FBI in 2016. His attorneys call me, and I've been dealing with his attorneys for some time, because he was accused of having provided information to one of our reporters, David Sanger, about the cyber attacks on the Iranian nuclear facilities. And they ask a very simple question, which isn't very simple, which is, can you help? He's going to be sentenced at some point. Will David Sanger write on behalf of General Cartwright and help the judge understand? And David felt very strongly that this was a misguided prosecution, that Cartwright had not been a major source in all of this. Cartwright was called in at the very end, and in fact, David had gone to the White House, and Ben Rhodes, the president's advisor, had said, go see Cartwright. He can help you understand what's really sensitive and what's classified but not that sensitive. He can help you understand, in other words, what to put in your book and what to put in your articles without jeopardizing national security, and that's always kind of a balance that people are looking for when they report these stories. So in the book, I walk through the steps that we go through and the agonizing we did, ultimately leading to a letter being put in at sentencing explaining how this kind of reporting is done and why Cartwright the court should look with discretion at Cartwright and see that he was not some wild-eyed leaker trying to hurt American national security. But you put your finger on it in the sense that the Pentagon Papers, the Alexander Bickel, who argues that case, talks about what he calls the disorderly situation, which is that the government should have great power to keep secret, to make things secret and protect secrets, and that includes prosecuting people in government who leak. And that the trade-off is that that once that information jumps over, crosses the line, ends up being in the hands of the press should have incredible freedom to publish it. And once you start saying, oh, no, don't prosecute the leakers, let us publish, but don't prosecute the leakers, that balance starts to come out of balance, and it's very hard to know what is the right position to take. How much are you supposed to help? Beyond the usual things, protect the source, you promise confidentiality, you live up to that, you don't do the things that make the person detectable in an investigation. But beyond that, that line's very hard to draw.
Do you think that there is room for media organizations to do more to defend their sources, not just to protect their privacy, but to defend the public interest in whatever they disclosed? Could media organizations do that without jeopardizing their own legal protections or jeopardizing, the credibility that they need in order to be able to persuade their readers that the stuff that they're publishing is stuff that they decided on their own, was in the public interest to publish? Right.
Well, I think there's several things, none of them perfect and none of them all that detailed. But one of the things is that there needs to be a fundamental change in the law, and that is there should be a public interest exception. A person who's in Chelsea Manning's position, or in anybody who's being prosecuted for leaking Thomas Drake, should be allowed to say this was in the public interest, and a jury should have a chance to decide whether that's so. Right now, that is not a defense you can offer. I think that our reporters and journalists on our side of who are doing national security reporting have to be constantly vigilant about not doing things that will lead to the finding of sources, and that gets harder and harder with electronic media, and we spend a lot of time thinking about that. If we are using electronic media, are we leaving a track back? One of the things that I point out in the book is that during all of these prosecutions under Obama and now into Trump, several of them have involved the New York Times, and we've never been contacted by the government about getting that information to name a source. And I also think that it goes back to what I hope is one of the good things that will come out of the book, which is that we should make this a subject of public discussion. We should help people understand why having confidential sources is important, why the publishing of even classified information is often in the public interest.
Is it fair to say that the protection of the identity of sources used to be principally a matter of law, and now it's principally a matter of technology?
About the pursuit of them, or the
the protection. Like your job as a. Yeah. Well, I know you have Runa Sandvik now, who's helping. Right.
So for a long time, they just sort of lapse here into a law moment, which is that the Supreme Court essentially said, although it was a little less than clear, that, and John will remember this Brandsburg case, that the protection of a source is not something that's dictated by the First Amendment. So there ensues this very ambiguous period in American law from 1972 forward about what the protection is. Courts saying that, well, there is some protection, here's what that protection is. But now I think there's a retrenchment where the courts are saying you don't have a right to protect your sources under federal law. But throughout that period, the Justice Department has voluntarily lived by the news media guidelines, and those guidelines have in large part worked, and they essentially say to prosecutors, don't go to the press except as a last resort. So to some extent, there's a quasi-legal protection that's been there. But you're absolutely right that in many of these cases now, if not most of them, in my experience at times, all of them, the government has not had to come and have a confrontation with the New York Times about naming a source. They have been able to follow electronic footprints and find the sources.
And to the extent they haven't, it's not because you've gone to a judge and quashed a subpoena.
Right,
it's because you've used Signal or some other method of protecting the communications.
Right.
I guess I'll ask you one more question and then open it up. So you say, close to the beginning of the book, you say being a media lawyer is a joy. And I'm just curious to know, what your favorite things are about this job, and are they the same things now as they were, when you started?
When I started, it was so much less polarized, and so whether you were a conservative or a liberal, you sort of believed at some level in the greatness of the mission of the First Amendment of journalism and all that. So to some extent, it was easier because when you stood up for the First Amendment, when you stood up for the press, that you didn't have to expect that 30% of the people hated your guts for doing so. That takes a little of the joy out of this. Okay. But at heart, as a failed journalist, and you can use as my hashtag, I love a good story. I love a good story, and it's incredible just to see how it's put together. When you see when it's done right and the sorts of things people are doing to find information, and to see that from inside is just kind of incredible. Whether it's finding a source or getting a piece of information. I talk in the Weinstein chapter where it's raining lawyers. It's raining lawyer letters. Oh my gosh, every day, another lawyer letter, here it comes, right? About, we're going to sue you, and we're going to do this, and we're going to do that. And I'm reading the draft of the Weinstein story, and I'm putting comments on there for Jody Cantor and Megan Toohey and their editor, Rebecca Corbett. And I call and say, look, or I do this markup and I send it back to them. And then Megan calls me and says, don't worry about this. We got it. Because Ashley Judd is going to go on the record. And when she goes on the record, the thread is going to be pulled. And that's exactly what happened. That was an incredible moment, I like that chapter because it really talks about sort of the joy of journalism and how that becomes infectious for me, and there's this story I talk about, and people have forgotten this, but before there was the Me Too Harvey Weinstein, there was the Harvey Weinstein feeding at the trough of the charity story, that he was involved in this very dodgy move to use charitable organizations to essentially fund a play he was putting on in Boston. And it was a very complicated story about the charities law and how charities work and all that kind of stuff, fairly thick going. And Megan pushed that story, and we published it. The important thing about that was it said, we're not scared of this guy. That we're going to publish hard stories about him. We don't care if he's an advertiser. We don't care what kind of influence. We don't care how many times he goes to dinner with the Clintons. And that, they really thought, helped empower sources.
Yeah, you have this great discussion of bias at the Times and what kind of bias you think does or doesn't exist there. And you want to talk a little bit about the bias that you think reporters sometimes exhibit? You know what I'm talking about?
I think this would be a good time to go to questions from the audience.
The bias I have in mind is not the one you're worried about.
Yeah. I hate this part. Anyway, that's a fair question. I put forth in the book a fairly robust libertarian view of the world, and I try to get at that by talking about what I see as some of the pressure from the left to get the New York Times to be more doctrinaire in how it publishes things. But and I make the point that reporters are biased, just not the way people think they are. That it's not we hate Donald Trump and the Republicans, and we love the Democrats. Bill de Blasio, Andrew Cuomo, awful relationships with the press, and I would dare say worse relationships. That most of, if I were to survey very informally our reporters, they would say that Donald Trump is a more likable person. They'd rather be locked in an elevator with Donald Trump than Bill de Blasio or Andrew Cuomo. But that's anecdotal. God forbid it happens to anybody, or all three of them. How about that? But the bias is really, look at. Here's what I see as the bias: is that nobody. One of the biases that nobody goes into journalism because they think they want to write great stories to make sure rich people continue to be rich and powerful people continue to abuse less powerful people. They go into journalism to change the world. And so all of those things, those great stories that call attention to injustice, that call attention to government abuses, that call attention to products that kill people, to factories that kill people, those are going to be the stories that win the hearts and win the prizes for journalists, not stories that stand up to status quo. And that's part of it. The second thing is, I tend to find that most reporters actually become very cynical of all people in power, whether they're liberals or whether they're conservatives. And so there is sort of an anti-establishment bias that they stand too close to these people. They see them. But the idea that there is sort of a liberal bias that says we're going to love the Democrats and hate the Republicans, I dare say that over the next year that Senators Sanders, Senator Klobuchar, Senator Harris are going to say, I really don't like what the New York Times is saying about me.
All right, questions? Yes, up here.
Thank you.
There's a mic coming around, and please just introduce yourself.
Sure.
Before your question.
My name is John Wallach. I'm a political theorist at the City University of New York. Thank you very much, and I'm teaching a class that engages with the material that you're talking about, and I very much appreciate the book. I hope you haven't misled me because I plan to buy it. But if we're moving towards a post-Trump era, we still will have the threats outside case law, which you identified at the beginning.
Yeah.
And in addressing them, and since we will have lived through this era, which you have noticed as significantly different than the ones we have experienced in the recent past, do you envision a different view of, let's say, the public truth that will be guiding the New York Times? Or do you feel that the Times might need to make an adaptation to its interest in serving the public that's not just technical or a response to technology, but involves a different view of public truth and how the Times constitutes that truth?
I'm going to go completely old school on you and say, no, I don't think so. I actually believe that the sort of things that have been our compass are worth preserving and keeping. Journalism is an art, not a science. We're going to get things wrong, but I think that the way journalism has been done for about 80 or 90 years is still the right way to do it, and that is a belief in facts, a belief in putting those facts into context, thinking about fairness, and taking seriously the obligation to hold power accountable. I think there's a lot of pressure to have a more, and I'm not saying this is what you're suggesting, but a more doctrinal form of journalism. And I frankly think that this is not the time when we need to do that, because that's out there in so many different places. There's so many choices. And I think that where I find my comfort with journalism is where the Washington Post, the New York Times, Wall Street Journal, and others are, which is saying, okay, if you want to argue the cultural war and you want to have point of view, you should have that. It's out there. It's in a lot of places. Where we bring value is to be what we hope is a trusted, honest broker.
Yeah, up top.
I'm Alexandra Starr. I'm a fellow at Columbia Journalism School. This is a question for both of you. Do you have advice on filing FOIA requests?
Yeah, boy, that's a really boring part of my normal day. So I'm going to do that, though. Yeah, you know, what I always say when I do my presentation on this is that too many requesters think of FOIA as a vending machine. You know, you put in the request is the money, you put it in there, and the stuff falls out. That's not how the vending machines work at the New York Times. You have to hit them, and you have to shake them, and a lot of times they take your money and they don't give it back and stuff like that. That's the vending machine you need to think about. I always tell people to think about a FOIA the way that you tell reporters think about FOIA the way they think about reporting, and that is you want to use all of your tools. You put in the request, get to know the FOIA officer, call the FOIA officer, and keep asking, keep asking, keep asking. I remember walking through the newsroom one day, and a reporter who had a long-running FOIA request was on the phone, and when I waited, and this is sort of a version of the call is, okay, well, you know, have a really good vacation. How old are your kids again? Oh, yeah, that's good. And so he hangs up. I said, who is that? Oh, that's the FOIA officer at the Department of Defense, you know. And it was that making that personal contact. And it shouldn't matter, but it does. And it's one tool, and it should be blended with all the others.
Yeah, right up here. I'm happy to talk afterwards about it.
Yeah, you can go with that.
David Shackner, John Jay College. Please share with us the challenges that your reporters have faced in Iran.
In Iran? Well, essentially in Iran, we have depended for about 20 years on Thomas Erdbrink, who is Dutch, and has managed successfully to negotiate through that very, very difficult situation there. As you know, Jason Rezaian of the Washington Post ended up being held for a long period of time, and his book is quite good, and I'd recommend that to you. Very heartfelt about what he went through. And what comes out of Jason's book is that it's just so unpredictable that within the government of Iran, there are factions, and they wield power, and they go after each other, and he gets caught up in that political struggle, it appears to be. So what makes it particularly difficult in this era for us is that if we run into a problem in Iran, it's not clear who we call. That in the relationship between the United States government and Iran is obviously at one of its worst valleys. And in most tough places, we are able to find allies to help us within our government or some other government, and that's becoming increasingly difficult. Even now, the Iranians and the Dutch are in a bit of a fight as well. But you should ask Leslie a rule of law question.
Go ahead.
Hi, Leslie Rosenthal. I work in the arts across the street. And speaking of allies, I feel like journalists have more allies than you leverage. And so I wanted to challenge you to crystallize in a couple of points why we should pay to subscribe to a newspaper and put our news gathering habits into the hands of professional journalists when it's so much easier and quicker to just go on Twitter and I can find out that Michael Jackson died or there was a tsunami in Japan or so forth. What's the value proposition?
Boy, that's a good question. You know, the value proposition, and I hope this comes out in the book, is that you're paying for a lot of judgment and you're paying for a lot of hard work in news gathering, and you just don't get that. You know, that so much. If I'm interested in an opinion, I think there's nothing better than Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, and so forth. I'm interested in an opinion about one thing, how the Yankees are going to do. And it is really great. The guys are really witty who are on that and so forth. But, you know, they're sitting on top of our reporting, right? Their opinions about Jacoby Ellsbury or anybody else is based on reporting being done on the ground by reporters. So I think that is a big part of the value proposition. It's expensive, and it's going to get more expensive. The advertising market is not going to come back. Google and Facebook have taken those dollars, and they're not coming back to newspapers. It's going to be heartbreaking in many small cities, which are essentially journalism-free zones. But I do think that it is kind of a golden age for Washington journalism. And the competition between the Post and the New York Times has been incredible for America and pushed the Post, and Post pushes us. And I think that, I hope that as part of that value proposition that you understand that we owe something to you as well. And that is our best judgment, our best attempt to get at the truth. And if we get it wrong, then we're going to try to fix it and tell that to you.
Well, one of the things that I think comes across really powerfully in the book is how much energy goes into deciding what not to publish. You know, what to redact, or you know, what stories you can't stand behind, or you know, you talk at one point about the tertiary characters that, you know, all the journalists focus on, you know, the one powerful person who, you know, whom the story is going to bring down. But there are, in paragraph 15 or 25, these other characters whose stories are also very important to them, at least.
Right.
And you make a lot of decisions about which, you know, whether those stories can be published. And that was very powerful to me.
Yeah. And it's, you know, it's an expensive operation. If you're going to maintain bureaus in foreign countries and the security network that we have to put in place to do that, and unfortunately we now have to have in the United States as well, that's just, getting that information to the public is really, really difficult. And you start to see so much cutting back, both in local journalism and international journalism. I was on a panel the other day with somebody who had been a State House reporter in Springfield, Illinois 30 years ago, and every paper of any size, every broadcaster of any size had a Springfield correspondent covering the state legislature. And now you're talking about a half dozen people there, and those guys will steal if you give them a chance. I know that.
All right, let's take one or two more. Yes.
Thank you. Richard Field, a lawyer. The media in a number of countries, maybe an increasing number, are widely considered less than credible because of ownership or law or other kinds of government control. Does the Times have an obligation to call that out, or is there some kind of professional courtesy or something else?
I do think there's an obligation to call it out, and I think we have done that. I mean, I think that what happens is the story of the media in other countries sometimes seems inside baseball-ish, that we are talking about ourselves, and so the coverage probably isn't as full because we're focused on what the government is up to in Egypt rather than necessarily the press relationships. But it's very important to do that, and we have done stories that were very helpful for me when I was doing the section of my book on covering the world of international reporting, foreign reporting, to see our discussion of the spread of the fake news mantra into other countries and how it was being used to oppress. We have tried to talk about what's going on in Turkey, which is an abomination. We've suffered from that ourselves, but just to see what has been happening to the press. Thankfully, really good work being done by Reporters Without Borders and the Committee to Protect Journalism to make those things palpable to people who care about them, and we need more of that.
If there's one more question, I think we have, right up here.
Hi.
Hey, John, how are you?
Jack McKenzie. I work for both papers you talk about, and I've ordered your class.
You did.
You, and I enjoyed that a lot. This is a lazy question, but what if Clarence Thomas got his way to get the court to reconsider Times against Sullivan? How would you defend it, and how would you argue it?
Okay, the question was that if Clarence Thomas had his way, okay, let that thought settle in for a minute, okay, and the court decides to reconsider Times versus Sullivan, what would be the argument to protect it? And answer that I would start with is that it has been the law, and very successfully the law, since 1964. It has worked. It has done what Justice Brennan wanted to do, and that is it has made lawsuits by the rich and powerful, libel suits by the rich and powerful, rare. That's what he intended to do. The court saw through what was going on, right? That libel lawsuits in 1964 were not being used to protect reputation. That was that was the illusion. That's what the tort's supposed to be about. They were being used to oppress and to stop Northern reporters from talking about what was going on in the South. Sullivan was a tin horn police commissioner in Alabama. He sues for $500,000. It wins $500,000 over an ad that appears in the Times by Martin Luther King's supporters, and it's clear what's going on there, and it's clear in the decision that these suits were being used by Southern power brokers to try to stop the coverage of the civil rights movement. I don't know any serious person in America who, as we look around at the problems we have, say, you know, the one we really need to be working on, we need more libel suits by rich and powerful people being successful. That does not seem to be the public policy outcome that most people think it should be on the front of the agenda. So I'd start with that it works. I think that contrary to what Thomas said, that there was he says there's no constitutional roots to it. I think that that's only if you believe in an originalist view of the Constitution, that most of the modern interpretation of the Constitution would say that, in fact, it reflected a robust tradition of constitutional analysis. And if I were, in the end, I really think that where the court is likely to go is not to just decide to throw it out and say, oh, the states get to decide again. I think they're more likely to focus on who's a public figure, which has never really been decided where the line is. And so I wouldn't be surprised to see some cutback in that way on the rules as to who becomes a public figure and has to prove actual malice versus the rest of us who have to prove negligence, which is an easier standard.
Thank you very much, David.
Thank
I
you.
think Karen is cutting us off.
Thank you.
So I'm not going to close with my usual here are your takeaways, because you guys were so great and succinct that I think they're obvious. But I am going to close with something else, which is something that Walter Lippmann wrote 100 years ago. And that, in fact, itself surprised me that it was actually 100 years ago, who considered this same topic, I'm sure you know, in many different venues, books, and articles. This is an article that appeared in The Atlantic in 1919 about trust, democracy, truth, liberty. And I'm just going to read you a couple sentences of it, but then you should all go home and read it. Go find it and read it for yourself. And I just want you to hear how this resonates with tonight's conversation. From our recent experience, it is clear that the traditional liberties of speech and opinion rest on no solid foundation. At a time when the world needs above all other things the activity of generous imaginations and the creative leadership of planning and inventive minds, our thinking is shriveled with panic. Men cease to say what they think, and when they cease to say it, they soon cease to think. And then he goes through this long thing about reporting and the levels of reporting and which gets closer to the truth, the more levels or the less levels. And he ends with this. This pursuit of the truth constitutes the meaning of freedom for us. In this view, liberty is the name we give to measures by which we protect and increase the veracity of the information upon which we act. So take that home and think about it. Good night. Thank you.